Hi everybody, my name is Naomi Arnold. I'm a researcher at Queen Mary University of London, and today I'm going to be presenting our work studying the AltRight network graph using temporal interaction graphs. This is a collaboration with colleagues at Queen Mary and also the UPM in Madrid. So if you haven't heard of Gab before, it's a social media platform which has a similar format to Twitter, where the difference that its tagline is being a social network that champions free speech, individual liberty, and the free flow of information online. And that's their front page tagline. And to this end, they have an extremely minimal moderation policy compared to online social networks. But this seems to affect that it's attracted people whose views might definitely not be acceptable on sites such as Twitter. It's been known as an alt-right safe space, and also happens to be the social network of choice of the Pittsburgh synagogue shooter. So some work is already known about Gab, the first one being a dive into the content and the user base of Gab, who found quite a high concentration of hate speech on there compared to Twitter. Some of the work has looked at the evolution of this language from sort of fairly more innocuous statements such as welcome new Gabbers at the start and becoming more and more hateful over time. Some work has looked at more at the social structure of Gab in terms of followers and following and reposts. And our work is aiming to bridge some of these aspects of structure and temporal evolution by looking at the evolution of social interactions over time. So the data set that we used is a collection of all the posts that occurred, apart from deleted ones, between the start of the site in August 2016 up to May 2018. And amongst this data set, we have 19 million posts and 170,000 users about that we collected. And to first get an idea of how the interactions and these interactions on Gab look like replying to people replying to each other's posts, we look at the edge rate, which is the number of interactions between each pair of users, the degree, which is the number of distinct users that a user interacts with, and also the interaction degree, which instead looks at the total number of interactions a user involved with. And we find that over half of the users that interact with each other only do so once and then never again, with quite a heavy tail. And our research questions with this data set in mind is firstly looking at growth, so asking the question, to what extent is Gab growing as a platform in terms of active users, and what drives this growth. The second question we look at is the idea of cohesion. So with Gab being quite popular with the alt-right, we were wondering whether it is a sort of single community or more disparate groups. And finally, we look at influence, so asking whether it's the same dominant users for the whole time or whether this changes much more. And we look at this using our approach of temporal interaction graphs. So how do we construct the graphs? If we can imagine this as a timeline of interactions going on, for example, user A and user B interacting, we construct our graph by considering a particular timescale with a width signified by this blue box tau. We take all the interactions that happen between that time window and construct a graph by adding an edge between users if they interact within that time window. And the idea is that as you increase the size of the window, you can capture more interactions and look at the sort of slow growth and evolution of the site, whereas smaller window sizes might reveal shorter bursts. So we consider different graph metrics over both different times and timescale window sizes. So first, to look at this question of growth and to what extent Gab is growing, we look at the number of users, and we count this as the number of users who interact or interact within a time window. this bottom graph here shows the number of users that we count according to different window sizes, going up from the daily window, which is the red, up to weeks, months, and up to 6 months. And then to further separate that, we distinguish between new users and users who are returning, and the top plot shows the proportion of those which are new. And we find that it's sort of slowly growing in larger window sizes over the time period, but this proportion of new users shows when we have bursts of views to the site. The biggest of these following the Trump election, and put the second biggest around the time of the Unite the Right rallies. Finally, something that's interesting is that there's a time when Twitter bans a large number of known white supremacists from the site, which seems to see a sort of sustained rise in the weekly and daily windows. Won't stay too long. We also see the same pattern in the number of edges and split those into new and current. We also find that over half of the interactions that happen are between users who've never previously interacted, which seems to contradict the idea of social networks reinforcing existing relationships. So secondly, we look at connectedness via the idea of the connected component, which is used in graph theory. And the most interesting finding we looked at from this was when we shrunk the window size down to an hour and looked at a typical week, we found actually that the largest connected component, it seems to form and shatter over the 24-hour period, corresponding to a diurnal cycle. And we see also that rather than having a single peak, there seems to be a small peak followed by a bigger one, sort of two groups of EU and a bigger US user base that have been found when people looked at language on the site. Finally, look at the idea of influence, and we do this by a fairly coarse measure of the node degree, so the number of users who interact with you. And we looked at a few different window sizes, but picked out the monthly and yearly ones. And we looked at the trajectories of the top 20 in-degree users of all time, and found that there's some which maintain a huge amount of influence on the site. So Andrew Tauber, the CEO of Gab, who represented by this blue line, attracted at some points on a monthly scale over 20% of the users active interacting with him, and whereas the yearly ones seem to show a much smoother change in influence over time. So to sum up the findings so far, when we looked at growth, we found that the user base is slowly growing on a sort of monthly, yearly basis. But the events of interest to the alt-right seems to be what drives mass migration to the site. When we looked at this idea of connectedness, we found this forming and shattering of the giant connected component, and we think this is the first time this has been observed in online social networks. With the influence, there's a small set of users who are dominant over a large proportion of the time. And something we delve into more in the paper is actually that there's a much larger pool of users who have the 15 minutes fame effect and are in the top 20 once and never again. But something that's might be useful if you're studying social networks is this idea of window-based graph analysis allowed us to gain like much more insights than just studying in an aggregate graph or a single window size. But thanks everyone for tuning into this, and I'll welcome any questions at the session on the 26th. There's a link to the preprint and also the tool that we use to generate the results here. Thanks.